What Bergoglio has done, Pope Francis has done, is showed me how to have so much joy in my life, to come at the social justice teachings of the Catholic Church with joy rather than through guilt, to understand mercy at a totally different level.
When Pope Francis arrived on the scene in March of 2013, the investigative work to uncover his life story began. Who is this man who, in a short period of time, has drastically shaken up the immutable Catholic Church? Mark Shriver, a lifelong Catholic, has been so moved by Pope Francis that he traveled to Argentina to find out for himself. The result? Pilgrimage, my search for the real Pope Francis. Today on Subject Matters. Mark, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me on. It's an honor.
Your book is a really wonderful journey through the life of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, and we meet a lot of fascinating characters along the way. And there's a lot of other books out there. There's a lot of biographies written about him. But talk to me about your approach in Pilgrimage. What direction did you choose to go?
Well, it's not a historical biography in the traditional sense of it. It's really a quest biography, which is the story of somebody trying to figure out who the man is. From his friends and his colleagues, his associates, people that didn't like him as well, his detractors. And I wanted to tell the story of who he is through their eyes and through their experiences in a historical context and in a timeline, of course, but really through their eyes. So instead of spending 20 pages talking about the economic recession in 2001, I spent 20 pages talking to one of the Pope's best friends, a guy who picks up trash, Sergio Sanchez, who's at Cartoneros, a guy who picks up cardboard and plastic and recycles it. So it's really through their eyes, which I think gives a much better insight into who the person really is, both the supporters and the detractors. And that's what it's about. It's a pilgrimage trying to figure that out.
You begin the book by talking about Rosa, who's Bergoglio's grandmother.
Yes.
And I can imagine that, being a Kennedy and a Shriver, that to really understand who somebody is, you have to know the family that they come from, the people that shape them the most.
Yes.
in their formation. So what did you learn about Rosa and her enduring kind of influence on Bergoglio?
And it really has been an enduring influence. He reads the note every day that she wrote him the day he went into the priesthood. She was a fantastic character, right? She is from Italy. She's a peasant woman. She's married. It's a coffee shop that they run. Her husband and her have a son, Mario, who is Pope Francis's dad. She stands up on a chair in the middle of a square and denounces Mussolini. Family leaves Italy, they go to Argentina. They set up and work in the family business in Argentina because there had been other folks in the family there. Mario, the son, gets married, introduced to his future wife by a Salesian priest. Heavy influence of Catholicism, obviously, in their life. Very Italian, very family-oriented. Grandmother lives next door to her son and her daughter-in-law. First child is Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the future Pope Francis, and she raises him, along with the mom, right in the neighborhood, a couple doors away, teaches him the lives of the saints, the rosary, takes him to church, takes him to the pre-kindergarten program in the church right around the corner, and a huge influence on his life. And also taught him how to be forgiving and inclusive, to reach outside of just the folks that are in the Catholic faith. And he talks about that in the book, and it's a great visual. It reminded me, I had a grandmother, Rose, who was born roughly at the same time, from obviously a different country, different background, but the influence of these grandparents, which Pope Francis talks about today, is profound. Too often in America, and I'm sure it's true here in Canada as well, you see grandparents on a holiday and then you don't see them the rest of the year. So I think it's re-emphasizing the importance of grandparents, having them be around and be an influence in your life.
One of the things that comes out in the book is that you were really moved by the church that Bergoglio experienced his conversion in, and that eventually decided to go to seminary based on an actual experience of going to confession.
Yes.
What was it about that moment? Because you talk about the simplicity of that and how that seemed to be very influential for him.
Yes. Well, he goes to a basilica for a confession on his way out with a group of friends. and it's early in the morning, and you think of a basilica as a great big church standing off on a hill. That's the basilicas I'd seen growing up in Maryland and being near Washington, D.C. This one is tight. It's a small, pretty nondescript basilica in a community on a bustling street. And when I walked in there were people, commuters coming in and out of the church, kneeling, people with babies in strollers. I mean, it's right in the heart of a community, and it's not that beautiful, frankly. I mean, it's a beautiful church, but it's not that beautiful, right? And I was initially disappointed, thinking, well, he should have found his calling in a fancy church, in a fancy confessional, but he's not. And that's actually part of the beauty of the story, is it's right in his home community, his home neighborhood of Flores. It's in a community, in a church that's not fancy. And then oftentimes that's the way God speaks to you. If you're listening, God speaks to you in the everyday experiences of your life. And it doesn't have to be in a big fancy cathedral. It doesn't have to be with pomp and circumstance. It can be in the everyday experiences of life. And that's what happened to him. So I think it's a better story, frankly. Yeah. It's a true story. And it's
more
a real
relatable
story.
to just your average.
Because it's everybody. Not everybody's going to a fancy basilica or a big cathedral.
Right.
We're in our neighborhood churches, and they're nice, but oftentimes they're not these stately institutions.
As a young man, Bergoglio finds himself with the Jesuits. Now, you know the Jesuits well because you were educated by the Jesuits. And you have a chapter actually on Ignatian spirituality, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius,
yes.
which are the spirituality of the Jesuits. But it's really a theme that's runs throughout the book. Like, you're constantly going back to the Jesuitness
yes.
of Bergoglio. How significant is that? Is his Jesuitness, in the person that he is and who he's become?
Well, as you know, Sebastian, he originally goes into be a diocesan priest, and the seminary is run by the Jesuits. And he has a near-death experience. He loses part of his lung, almost dies, like Ignatius of Loyola, who started the Jesuits, as you know, almost died after a battlefield wound. And he then decides to go into the Jesuits. And I think the Jesuits, Ignatius's idea of the Jesuits always being ready to go to the frontier, right, of accompanying people on their journey in life as pilgrims, right? That they are on the frontier and willing to go anywhere for the poor and the powerless. And the discipline of the Jesuits, the nickname for the Jesuits is God's army. Right. So they're structured, they're disciplined, they're highly educated, and that appealed to him. And he has said it multiple times that he wanted to go to Japan to be a missionary, to be part of the Jesuits over there. He couldn't go because of his health issues. But I think that discipline and that focus, and obviously the 30-day silent retreat, and that ability to discern God's voice where you're quiet and listening for direction from God is what has defined Bergoglio. He's often said that his initial reaction to a situation, to a problem, is wrong. And what he tries to do is to discern where he should go, and whether it's being cardinal or bishop or now pope. He wants to talk to other people, but then he wants to obviously pray and listen to God's voice to try to discern the right answer.
And sometimes that means changing your mind or being open to thinking something different than you thought it might be.
I mean, if we all thought the same way we did when we were 20, it'd be a pretty boring world.
Yeah.
And we'd be in trouble, right? Because you grow and you learn. And he is who he is today is not who he was when he was 30.
Right. And
I think that's a great part of his story, is he had this incredible rise to the power at a young age, being provincial, the head of the Jesuits from both Paraguay and Argentina. At the age of 36, which he has said it was way too young, and a very volatile time in the history of his country. As a fall, he's exiled, some 12 years later, and then he comes back as a different man, as auxiliary bishop, then bishop and cardinal.
We're going to get into that a little bit
yes.
Later, but we have to take a short break. But more with Mark Shriver right after this. Mark Shriver is president of Save the Children Action Network. He holds a BA from the College of the Holy Cross and a master's in public administration from Harvard University. He was a member of the Maryland House of Delegates from 1994 to 2002 and has spent his life fighting for social justice in advocacy and service organizations, advancing the right of every child to a safe and vibrant childhood. He lives in Bethesda, Maryland with his wife and their 3 children. For Bergoglio, because of his grandmother Rosa and Ignatius of Loyola, faith in God was the consuming love of his life. His charisma and intellect would quickly land him in leadership roles, but his all-consuming faith would set him apart as much as those 2 worldly talents. We're back with Mark Shriver discussing his book, Pilgrimage, My Search for the Real Pope Francis. And Mark, you follow Bergoglio's path to the Collegio Maximo, which is where he studied in Buenos Aires, a Jesuit university, but he also found himself rector of that university after he was provincial. And it was really the height of his influence, as a clergyman and as a Jesuit in Argentina at that time. And he ran kind of a tight ship. And then he was eventually exiled, as you mentioned just before the break. But he appears to be, and this comes out in your book, that he was a much different man at that point than he was today. Who was he at that time?
Well, I think he assumed a big position of responsibility at 36 years of age as provincial. He is in the middle of the dirty war, comes about a couple of years later. And then he becomes rector of Collegio Maximo, as you say, the Jesuit formation house there in Buenos Aires. And you also got to contextualize this. This is just 15 or so years after Vatican II, when there was a lot of confusion about what was coming, what Vatican II meant. You had liberation theology. You had political unrest in Central and South America, where some folks thought that liberation theology was really an effort by communists to overthrow existing governments. And you had a lot of chaos and confusion. And almost everybody I talked to in Argentina told me that that period of the dirty war was so complicated and so complex. They use that term constantly, Sebastian, saying the Army didn't know what the Navy was doing, the Navy didn't know what the Army was doing, nobody knew what the police force was doing.
And they were all Catholic, which is an incredible dynamic.
I mean, in Argentina, you had to be a Catholic to be president. It was part of the Constitution until just a few years ago.
Right.
So people, as Bergoglio himself has said, there were sinners and saints. There were people that thought they were doing the right thing for the country that were committing crimes, and there were others that were trying to change the government that were also committing crimes. So it was chaotic. And then he comes out of that and starts running Collegio Maximo, and he had a very strict interpretation of the philosophy and theology that should be taught to young novices, and that rubbed a number of the Jesuits in that country the wrong way. Some of them believed that the Jesuits should move out of Collegio Maximo, out of community, and go live in poorer towns and communities. And as you know, part of the Jesuit order is based around community. They have to live together, which is different than diocesanes. And we generally live on one or two. Jesuits are supposed to live together. So there was some conflicts in there, and as a result of his authoritarian ways, essentially split the provincial in half.
Right.
And that's why he ended up being exiled in 1990, sent to Cordoba without really any responsibility,
right.
Except for to hear confessions and to tend to the older Jesuits who were dying.
You write in the book, you actually pose this question, through that experience in Cordoba, why and how did the pious, disciplined, focused patriarch blossom into the smiling, big-hearted, gregarious shepherd that we know today? So something happened in Cordoba that changed this man dramatically. What did you discover?
Well, I think it was not having any responsibility, and he understood that he had made mistakes. And I don't want to say it was a 2-year spiritual exercise, but he has said that it was a tough time. It was a dark night of the soul, if you will. And I think he realized that he needed to be more merciful. He needed to be more inclusive in his decision making. He needed to enter into the chaos and pain of other people's lives in order to help discern where he should be making decisions. So it was a tough time. I was in his room in Cordoba. It's a small little room with a double bed, place to kneel, a bureau with 3 drawers, a chair. And it overlooks an alleyway where the students from Cordoba University used to get drunk and walk down there and keep them up on Friday and Saturday nights. He never complained, evidently. And the Jesuits all told me he just grunted through it, even though it woke him up at night. So I think it's a great part. It makes him more human. He had a rise to power. He's a brilliant guy. He made mistakes. He comes down. He has an exile. And then he has another different rise in which he learned. And that second rise to power is eventually the man we know today. I mean, it didn't happen overnight, right?
Right.
He didn't have a Saul on the road to Damascus moment where he's blind for a number of days. And I think this happened over time. And what happened as a result of the economic crisis in Argentina in the early 2000s, I think also made him more sensitive to the needs of the poor and the working poor.
Once he was made auxiliary bishop and eventually found himself the archbishop and then Cardinal Bergoglio before he was elected, there's some very powerful testimony in your book from some interesting folks. You actually made your way to some of the most dangerous parts of Buenos Aires, into the barrios, the slums of the city, where you met especially a couple of priests. This was the longest chapter of your book, I noticed.
Yes.
Toto and Pepe, these guys that you talked to. And it was a remarkable thing. I mean, your driver didn't even want to drive you there because of the danger, because it's an incredibly violent place. But you find these two priests who know Bergoglio very, very well from the time that he was bishop there. What did they tell you about?
These are diocesan priests, Sebastian. You love them. I mean, Father Pepe was a priest, dropped out for a little bit, came back after he had spent a year being counseled by, at that point, Cardinal Bergoglio. He has huge admiration for the Pope. Pope put him in this Via 2124. He built a number of chapels, small chapels throughout the Via. He's working with kids that have drug and alcohol problems, homelessness, drug gangs down there. And he's, if you open the newspaper tomorrow and you read on page 20 that Father Pepe is dead, it wouldn't surprise you, because he's right in there doing God's work. And he's so calm, big brown eyes. He's got a number of keys on his belt, because he's opening the church. He's opening the offices in there. There's no secretary. It's not fancy. The church is, the study hall area. It's the area where the kids play after school. I mean, it's really poor. And those are the kind of priests that Bergoglio put out all across Buenos Aires. Father Toto had incredible energy, and these guys that were down there who told me about how Bergoglio had come in and baptized their kids are all very poor, mostly immigrants from Paraguay. And they told about how Bergoglio would take the bus and walk the last 3 blocks through the muddied, potholed streets. And that Father Pepe would say, "Let's somebody go pick him up in the car," and they'd go. He'd say, "No, I'm walking." And he came in there on his day off. On his days off, he'd hang out there. I mean, he'd come for services on holy days and so forth, but that's where he would hang on his days off, which just shows you the type of guy he is and his commitment to going to the frontiers, because the frontiers don't have to be on the other side of the world. They can be in your own neighborhood, in your backyard.
What were you thinking when you were sitting there talking to those guys?
They had so much faith, right? I asked Pepe, because I didn't know whether to hug him or to cry, because he was doing a funeral preparation for a guy who had been shot a couple days earlier, a block away at noon. He said that it's dangerous. And he was taking the phone calls, and he's like a modern day martyr potentially. And just the faith. I asked him, are you afraid of being killed? And he looked at me, "No, I'm doing God's will. I'm totally fine."
And Bergoglio was one of them.
Yeah, right in there. I mean, Bergoglio offered to go down and take Pepe's place down there, and I said, "Of course not. You're the cardinal. You can't come down here." But he's hanging out in those neighborhoods on a regular basis, including, as I said, on his days off, which is, as a supposedly progressive Catholic from America, that's not where I'm hanging out on my days off, right?
Right.
So it's a challenge, amazing. But he does it from a place of joy. It's not a place of Catholic guilt. He goes down there because that's what he enjoys doing. And these guys that are down there telling stories clearly miss him and clearly liked him.
Right. Well, we have a guest review of your book today. Austin Ivory is a contributing editor at Crux. You can read his stuff at cruxnow.com. He's also the author of a wonderful book on Bergoglio called The Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope. Austin.
Hi, Sebastian. Hi, Mark. It's great to be with you both. Here is a copy of the book, Pilgrimage by Mark Shriver, which, in fact, I knew Mark was working on a long time before it was published, because he contacted me and asked for some help. And I really got a strong sense, and I knew from people he'd been talking to in Rome, that he was putting an awful lot into this. That said, I wasn't expecting to enjoy it, because I thought it would be a kind of a rather personal, rather mushy, rather sentimental kind of a book which didn't ultimately tell you very much we didn't know about Francis. Well, I was wrong about that. It's a fascinating account of his life. It's not a biography, and yet it is packed with insights, gems, stories, conversations, dialogues, which really throw new light on Pope Francis, that bring you much, much closer to him and to understanding what makes him tick. And of course, the dynamic of the book, it's very, very well put together, very well constructed as a personal move, as a personal journey, hence the title Pilgrimage, towards his subject, who is a hero. And I think one of the interesting things there is how Mark, is aware that he's going in search of somebody, to understand somebody he admires, he looks up to. Very enjoyable, very funny at times. I laughed a lot at the descriptions of Buenos Aires on these hair-raising taxi rides. He's always late for appointments, which always happens to me in Buenos Aires. It's a great sprawling city. It's tough to get around. So hats off to you, Mark, for a really terrific book, which really does show Francis in an important new light and makes him, I think, accessible to many, many people in a new way. And as I've said on the back, and I'll say it again, this deserves to be ranked among the best of the books about this figure who really has emerged as one of the most compelling and important on the world stage. So I just want to end, Mark, with my question to you, which is, we've both been on the Bergoglio trail, as I call it. We've both been transformed by the experience, and yet neither of us, even though I've met him a few times, just very briefly for a minute here and there, but neither of us have ever had sit-down interview time, unlike many journalists. And I just wondered that now, after writing his story, if you did have that chance to sit down with him, but if it was very short, it was just 15 minutes, and you were told, look, you can really only stick to one area of his life, I just wonder what you would choose, what it is you would want to ask him about.
Okay, thank you, Austin. Well, Mark, you never got the chance to interview Pope Francis as you had wanted to.
Yes.
But if you did have the chance to speak to him about one aspect of his life, you only had a couple minutes, what would you ask him?
Well, Austin asking me that question is really hard. And he has written, I think, the best book on Pope Francis. He's an incredibly talented writer. I could ask him 100 questions. I'd ask him, first of all, I'd ask him if he wanted a mate, that drink that I've had when I was in Buenos Aires, because I think that would kind of make it a fun conversation. I'd talk to him about his grandmother, Rosa. I'd ask him about Sergio Sanchez and Father Pepe and Toto. I'd ask him so many questions. So I didn't answer the question correctly. But the other thing is, I'm not sad I didn't get the interview with him, and I'm not sad that I'm not asking him a question, because I learned so much from his writings, from talking to his friends. That's what the book is about. It was a 2.5-year journey that I'm still on, because we're all pilgrims, right? Mm-hmm. And what he taught me then and continues to teach me every day through his actions and his words are so powerful. So you just be quiet and listen to the guy and study him a little bit and pray on it a little bit. He's still teaching, so I don't really have to have the conversation. But I'd like to have a mate with him. That would be fun. Right?
That would be great. I think he would have one with you, too.
I don't know, but that'd be fun.
We have to take one more break, but when we come back, some concluding thoughts from Mark Shriver. Don't go anywhere. Pilgrimage, My Search for the Real Pope Francis, is published by Random House and is available for purchase at penguinrandomhouse.ca and at Ben McNally Books in Toronto. Also by Mark Shriver, the New York Times and Washington Post best-selling memoir, A Good Man, Rediscovering My Father, Sergeant Shriver, published by Henry Holt. One could describe Bergoglio, exaggerating only slightly, by paraphrasing his own words when he described the Catholic Church during the Dirty War, part sinner, part saint. I prefer the image that Father Scanoni painted when he told me, I have seen him grow through every stage of his life. He was like a flower that was growing and growing and is now blooming. Mark, one of the great things about your book is, as we've discussed, that you weave this personal faith journey into your pilgrimage through the life of Bergoglio. And at one point in the beginning of the book, you actually write that the personal context that you're coming to this story with is kind of skeptical, disillusioned, and a little bit uncertain about whether the church actually remained a force for good in the world. So going through this pilgrimage, did it change you? Did it change the way you look at your church, the Catholic Church? Well,
the short answer is yes. The long answer is I've always had huge respect for the nuns and priests that I know, not only in America but around the world, that are doing great work. Teaching kids, taking care of people that have AIDS and HIV, elderly folks. What Bergoglio has done, Pope Francis has done, is showed me how to have so much joy in my life, to come at the social justice teachings of the Catholic Church with joy rather than through guilt, to understand mercy at a totally different level, not to be nicer to people or to give a bigger check to my favorite nonprofit, but to really try to develop intimate relationships with people, to understand their joys, their sadnesses, their confusion, their chaos, and to enter into that relationship, a more intimate relationship with God as well. So he's been a great teacher. And like the great Jesuit teachers I had in high school and college, they continue to teach if you listen. So in that regards, he's definitely got me a little more fired up, no question about it. Ignatius has got that great line about go forth and set the world on fire. And I think Pope Francis gets up every day and he's ready to set it on fire because he's working from joy. He's not even working, it's all from joy. And I think that energy is contagious.
Is there anything, now that you've studied his life and you've met so many people that knew him at different stages, does anything that he does or says surprise you now?
That's a good question. I think every day he's doing something. I mean, when I was writing the book, I said to my wife, I wish this guy would take a month off. Because it's just every day there's something going on. He's coming to America and he's saying something in Philadelphia that's different than what he said in Washington, D.C. And he's driving around in a Fiat when President Obama is driving around in a huge SUV and a 78-year-old man's in the back seat of a little Fiat. He's sending messages, right? Mm-hmm. And he's talking about encyclicals on the environment, and he's just challenging people on a daily basis. He's bringing refugees back to live with him in the Vatican. I mean, come on. So every day the guy's doing something. And that's what great teachers do. They challenge you. And in this regard, as I said before, he's challenging from a place of joy. And to have an 80-year-old guy doing that, wow. Catholic Church is lucky.
Certainly are. Mark Shriver, thanks a lot for being here. Really appreciated having you on.
Thanks a million for having me, Sebastian. It was fun.
The book is Pilgrimage, My Search for the Real Pope Francis by best-selling author Mark Shriver. You can get it right here at Ben McNally Books in Toronto or online from Penguin Random House. Just go to penguinrandomhouse.ca. Mark is president of Save the Children Action Network in Washington, D.C. You can learn more about their wonderful work at savethechildrenactionnetwork.org, and you can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark_Shriver. I want to thank our guest reviewer, Austin Ivory. He's the author of The Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope, and he's a contributing editor at Crux. You can read his enormously insightful commentaries at cruxnow.com and follow him on Twitter at AustinI. And remember, if you'd like to see my video review of Pilgrimage, just visit our website, saltandlighttv.org/subjectmatters. Thanks a lot for joining us today. We'll see you again next time. Subject Matters with Sebastian Gomes is sponsored by the Cullen family. Our Salt and Light team works hard to bring you quality Catholic programming like Subject Matters. Please consider supporting our mission by making a donation today. Thank you for your generosity, and remember, our hope begins with you.